On the subject of writing, Gertrude Stein once said, "Why should a sequence of words be anything but a pleasure?" I say, why should a photograph be anything but a pleasure to look at? Here's an example of an image that's sort of ruined by a faded locomotive. Wouldn't it be nice if we could somehow fix this photo and create the image we really wanted instead of the one we actually ended up with? In the video tutorials that follow, I'll show you how to change this image into this image. Before we really get started on anything, let's just do a brief overview of what we need to do. This image has a multitude of sins, as you can clearly tell, but most of them center around the locomotive, so we'll start with that first. I do a Control-Alt-0 to get to 100%. We can sort of look at some of these and see what they are. Clearly the faded orange paint is one of our biggest worries, but that's actually one of the last things we're going to correct. We do need to do a little bit of touch-up here. You'll see up by the roof there's some spots that are missing paint. You can see the fuel tank has been scratched up. It's missing some paint as well. Up here on the anti-climber there's a rusty area that we're going to need to clean up. Of course the image is a little bit more side-lit than we'd like, so we need to lighten up the dark side of the nose. And there are many other things that we'll need to do, such as clean up the yellow here, make it brighter. Need to clean up some of the faded green, make it look more fresh. And then over here we might want to do some things to the background as well, like darken that sand, probably darken the sky, maybe take out some poles, things of that nature. But the overriding concern is that we do all of our work on layers, and if we're going to do any touch-up work, we'll of course want to do that on a duplicate of the background layer. So the very first thing is to grab the background layer, drag it down here, create a duplicate, and make sure that that duplicate is selected, as you can see there. So now we're actually ready to begin work. The first thing we're going to do is fix the fuel tank. I'm at 100% right now. I'm going to go ahead and click Control Plus to get it 200 so I can see a little better what I'm doing here. I want to make a selection of this tank so that when I use my cloning tool I don't spill over the edges. Now I've taken the liberty of using the pen tool here to make a path around the tank, and I've already done that ahead of time to save us some time. So I'm going to go ahead and select that path, and you can see it there, the lines. Hopefully it'll show up on the video. And I'm going to make a selection of that. Don't want any feathering, do want anti-alias, do want new selection, so I click OK. Now we're ready to begin our work with the cloning stamp, which I've already got selected. It's important to check your brush. Size doesn't matter because we can adjust that on the fly. Hardness I want about 50% is fine. My mode is normal, so I think we're ready to begin. What I'm going to do is I'm going to move my brush. It's about the right size already, so I'm going to move the edge of it to about right here. I'm going to hold down the alternate key, and I'm going to click. Now I'm going to move over here. I just defined my source. Now I'm going to define my target. I'm holding the left mouse button, and I'm starting to paint with it. I'm just dragging, holding the button down, and I'm watching as I go along. I'm eventually going to hit an area where we've run out of good pixels, and you can see that I'm hitting it right now because we're starting to get that edge down there. So now I'm just going to go back and do the same thing. Move back here, my brush edge against the edge of the selection. I alternate left click right there, and I'm going to come up here and start painting again and drag down this way, and we'll probably run out, and I can move up a little bit too if I need to. We're just trying to clone some of the good stuff over the bad stuff there, and I need one more try. And you can see that what I've done by having that selection, you notice if I drag down here, I'm not actually painting because of that selection. So now I think we've done a pretty good job there. So let's get rid of that selection, Control D, and there we have the tank fixed. This time we're going to work on the paint spots up here on the roof, and we're going to use a slightly different technique. In looking at this area, I think the best way to do this is going to be cut and paste. So I'm going to take the marquee tool here, and I'm going to look at an area. I want to include this edge here, so I'm going to look at this area right here, and I'm going to sort of select an area about like this. I want to go down far enough to cut over top of that area where the paint's missing. So I'm going to define a selection about like that. I'm going to do a Control C to copy and a Control V to paste, and now I'm going to press the V key by itself. That gives me the move tool, and now I'm just going to drag this pasted piece over until it's over top of the paint spot there, and I can use my arrow keys to move one pixel. You'll notice I'm zoomed in to 200% so I can get this just precisely where I want it. I think that's good. Let's do another Control V to paste yet another copy of it, and we'll move it into place maybe about here, use the arrow keys again to move this until that line is precisely where I want it, about right there. Do another Control V to get yet another piece. We'll put it over here. Move it into position, something about like that. Don't worry about this little piece here. We'll fix it in a minute. And finally, one more Control V and put this last piece in place. I think that looks pretty good. So now let's go over to the layers palette and take a look at what we've got. See, we've got these 4 layers here, each one of those for each piece that we pasted there. If we shift and click, we can select all 4 of those, and we right click and say merge these layers. So now if we turn this off, we see there's what we had originally, and here's what we have now. And I think that looks pretty good. Now, the one thing I do want to do is clean this up right here. So let's get the eraser tool over here. And you'll notice I'm on layer 4, which is my merge layer of all these copies. So if I just start painting away, you see I get rid of that, and I don't want to do that, so I'll do a Control Z. I just want to paint away this little piece right there. And so now I think that's good. And now actually, if I want, I can merge this with my background copy layer. This is the edit layer we were working with. So I think that's pretty good. I think we've fixed that. Next time we'll probably have to fix these other areas up here. They're going to be a little more challenging, and we'll use a different technique to do that. We're going to fix these spots up here on the roof that don't have any paint in them. Before we do that, let's go over to the layers palette and let's just create a new layer here to work on, so if we screw up we can get rid of it without causing ourselves too much grief. We're at 100% view right now. Let's do a Control plus a couple times here, zoom into about 400%. Hold the space bar to get the hand tool so we can move things around. And you can see these gray areas, splotchy areas up here that don't have any paint. And what we want to do is try to cover those with paint. And I think to do that we'll use the clone stamp tool. You'll notice I got my opacity at around 70%, so it's not at 100. And the reason I'm going to do that is because I want to try to blend some of this. So let's just put one thumb on the alternate key. So when I press that down and then I left click, that's my source. And you're going to have to continue to do a lot of alternate left clicking to define the source, because as you move, of course, as you're painting with that, the source moves too. And we really have such a small area of good paint here that we have to keep using it over and over and over again. Now, as you're doing this, you need to sort of be careful and watch for some of these details here. You see, this is actually the edge of one of those roof panels, and I don't want to eliminate that detail, nor do I want to eliminate the lift ring or the shadows of it. I just want to get rid of these lighter gray areas in here. And you can see that I'm working at such an extreme magnification here. It allows me to be very precise with my cloning stamp tool. And also by using the lowered opacity, we're able to do a little bit better job of blending these various colors in the roof in, so that we don't get a lot of artificial edges in here that look like we've been in there monkeying around. So I think we're getting pretty close to being done here. Just a couple more areas, this one over here in particular, to touch up. And as you can see, I'm just going back and grabbing a new source and then putting it over the target areas here that need it. And we just keep doing this, trying to eliminate the areas where it looks like there's paint missing. And as we continue, here I'm just trying to do a little bit of blending so this darker green edge down here doesn't look quite as artificial as it might otherwise. We got that last time from the cut and paste exercise we did, trying to fix that. So anyway, I think this is about good enough to take a look at. So if we do a Control Alt 0, there it is at 100%, and I don't think it looks terrible. Again, we can see the effect of what we've done. Remember, we did this on this new layer we created. So if we turn that off, there's what it looked like originally, and here's what it looks like after we fixed it. Things don't have to be perfect, but I think that's a good improvement, so we'll just call it good. We're going to clean up the anti-climber, but first let's take a look at what we did last time on this layer here. We fixed all those spots up there on the roof, and I took the liberty of cleaning up a few other little defects up there in the green area. So there's before, there's after. I'm pretty happy with that, so let's go ahead and merge this into our work layer here. And now let's create a new layer on which we will clean up the anticlimber. Holding the spacebar to get the hand tool, we'll move over. We'll control plus a couple times here, get up to about 400%. This time we're going to use the clone stamp tool. My opacity is back to 100. Note that I have sample current and below instead of current layer. That's important because otherwise this is not going to work on a new layer. So let's hold the alternate key down. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to clone from this area here, which is good, over into this area here, which is not. And the trick that I'm going to use is I'm just going to copy from here over to here, but I've got to do it in such a way that everything's lined up. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to hold the alternate key down, and I'm going to move that little crosshair target until I think it is right on the edge. And you see I'm zoomed in so much here, it's kind of hard to define exactly where the edge is. So I say it's in the middle of that fuzzy area, so it's about right there. Now I'm going to left click my mouse button just once with the alternate key held, and that defines my source. So now I need to move over to where I want to copy this, which is somewhere about in here. And I'm going to press the alternate key, but I'm not going to click my mouse. I'm just holding the alternate key down, and I'm going to move again to what I think is about the same place relative to that edge, which is probably about right there. And now I'm going to let up on the alternate key. Now I'm going to press my mouse button, and I'm going to start painting. Now that didn't really work out as well as I had hoped, although it's not too bad. And we'll see. We're zoomed in so much here. Now you note I can't really go too far over that way, or I run out of source material. So we're just using the clone stamp here, and that's not terrible. I'm going to make my brush a little smaller, left bracket a couple times, and we'll alternate click somewhere in here. Now we're going to clean this little scratch up in through here. But anyway, what I wanted to show you was that alignment trick. It perhaps didn't work as well as I wanted, although it worked perfectly fine. Let's try it again over here, right bracket a few times. Let's try maybe about right there for the source, and about right here for the target maybe. And it's still not that great, but you know what, I don't think we're going to be able to see it in any event. It's not super hard to fix. This is something about like that. So let's do a Control-Alt-0. And yeah, I guess you can see that, so maybe I'll go back and touch that up, but it's not such a big deal. And remember, we did it on a layer, so I tell you what, if everything is just a complete catastrophe, take that layer that we just worked on and throw it in the trash and do it again. And that's really why we do it on layers. But anyway, you get the general idea. Try it a few times and it'll work. Now that we've taken care of the cloning related tasks, let's just briefly see what we've done here. And of course we did all of our work on multiple layers that we merged back into a work layer. So if we turn that off, we can see here's the original image, and notice particularly the fuel tank, the roof above the BNSF lettering, and the anticlimber. And as I turn this on, there's what we've done. And you'll notice I've cleaned up a few other areas, like some rust on the handrails and some little scratches in other parts of the paint. But basically the idea here was we were just getting rid of some minor defects that cloning was really the only way to get rid of. And now of course we're ready to work on the biggest visually obvious defect, and that's the faded paint itself. Now, you know, one way to naively go about this is to do something like the following. Let's suppose, for instance, that we do a select color range and we just try to select all the orange. So I'll start like that. Notice my fuzziness is relatively low, and I click the add tool, or I could have just held down the shift key. But then I just kind of drag around all of the orange here, including this faded stuff and maybe this stuff up here and some of this and some of that and some of that, and basically just try to select all of the orange, because it's logical to think that, well, if the problem here is faded paint, the way to restore it is saturation. Now let's suppose that we've done that, and so we do this selection, right? And now we do a Control-H just to hide the selection because it's kind of annoying to look at. Now we do a Control-U to bring up hue saturation, and since it's faded, obviously pulling the saturation all the way over fixes the problem, right? Well, apparently not. There's before and there's after, so in this case, saturation is essentially useless. I just wanted to show you that to show you that that's really not going to be an effective way to fix the problem. As I hinted at earlier, the right way to fix it is with a curves adjustment layer. But before we can really do that, we need to understand more about color. As it turns out, fixing the color really isn't that much of a problem, but we do kind of have to understand what we're doing. So I think it's important at this point to do a little bit of a review of some of the tools that we're going to be using in case you're not comfortable in being proficient with them. I admit some of the techniques are somewhat advanced and potentially intimidating, but I'm really of the opinion that anybody can do it. I'm not the smartest guy in the world, and I figured this out, so I think anybody can do it. First thing I want to look at is the curve itself. So I've created a curves adjustment layer here. It's a brand new one. By default, they come with a all-inclusive layer mask here, but that's not really what I want to talk about just yet. Let's look at the curve itself. So if I double-click that, you notice a couple of things about it. First, we've got this nice histogram here in the background. But you notice that we have this little icon down here, this little warning sign. What that's telling you is that this histogram is not actually correct. So if we push this button, it'll recalculate. Now we're looking at the correct histogram for this image, which is the one of our locomotive and the train. Couple points to make here. By default, you're looking at RGB, which is really luminance, and this just shows us the range of values from dark to bright. And really there's a couple points to make here. So the way to understand a curve is along the bottom. This is really a graph, and the input is along the bottom, and you can imagine black over at the left side and white over at the right side. The output is along the vertical axis here, and again black is down at the bottom and white is up at the top. Now these little graduated bars here kind of show you which way these curves are going, and you'll notice that the curve itself is this diagonal line from the lower left corner to the upper right corner. So what that shows you is that there's no adjustment being made by this curve. In other words, every input value is translated directly to an equivalent output value. So for instance, 128, 128 is exactly the center of this graph, and you can see as I move my crosshairs there, that's exactly what it shows. Another way to think of the curve is that over to the left side would be your shadows, over to the right side would be your highlights, and right here in the center would be your midtones. So some really elementary things would be like if I want to brighten my midtone, I just grab a hold of the curve in the middle of it and I bring it up, and that will brighten my midtones. Likewise, if I wanted to brighten my shadows, I would grab somewhere down here and move up, because that's lightening my shadows. Or if I wanted to lighten my highlights, I would grab up here and move up. Now, one thing that's instructive when it comes to doing adjustments with curves is that really the only direction we move is up and down. It is possible, of course, to drag left and right, but that's really the wrong way to think about it. You should always think about curves in terms of moving up, which is brighter, and down, which is darker. And this applies no matter where you pick a point. So I've got 3 points here. Let me delete those briefly. Another important little piece of this curves adjustment layer is this little tool right here. If I click on this, what this will do is a couple things. First of all, it will give me this little bouncing ball that moves around. As I move through the image, what it's showing you is what is the luminance value at that point. So as I go to a dark area like this, see it goes down towards the left side, which indicates that this area is very dark. And if I move to, say, like this faded paint here, it moves up towards the highlights, indicating that that area is relatively bright. Now, as I said at the beginning, we're on the RGB curve, which is really luminance. That's why the histogram is displayed in gray. We can also break this down into the constituent red, green, and blue. So if we pick red, for instance, now we're looking at just the red channel. And as we move our little tool across the image, we're looking at how much red is in any particular color that we happen to be over. So on this orange, which is highly red, you can see that there's quite a bit of it there. The little bouncing ball's way over to the right side, meaning that the red channel is very bright. If I move to this dark green, of course, there's not a lot of red in that, so the red value is quite low. And of course, as I mentioned before, all the adjustments we could make on the RGB channel, we can also make on the individual channels themselves.
Another thing that I want to point out here, let's go back to RGB, is you notice that there's a wide distribution of luminance values in this histogram that we're looking at here. And that's because we're looking at the entire train image. Let me do a Control-Alt, or a Control-0, I'm sorry. And this background image here is really what this histogram has been computed over. So a couple of things to note. You notice that there is a spike. There's a cliff over here at the left side. That means we actually do have some shadows that are blocked. And if I hold down the alternate key and I start to bring this forward, you can see the black areas are where the channel is clipped. So that means we do have some shadow areas that have no detail in them, perhaps indicating that the image is underexposed, although I happen to be of the opinion that there should actually be solid black in the image somewhere. Likewise, if we go over here on the right side and we hold down the alternate key and we start to drag this in, you'll see that there are some channels that are clipped. If you could see the headlights of the locomotive, they would be white at this point. Another point I want to make, let's go over to this image. This approximates what I believe to be BNSF orange when it's brand new. And let me add a curves adjustment layer to it. Now, it's displaying a histogram, but you may not be able to see it. It's actually right here because it's a single color. In other words, this entire image here is just one color. There's no variation to it whatsoever. So if we go to the red channel, you'll just see a little red spike here at the value of this color, which happens to be 247, I think. If we move my cursor over there, it's 248. So this color in this square over here is 248, 118, 12, red, green, blue. So if I go to my curve and I look at my histogram, this is 248 and this is 118 and this would be 12. So if I want to change the color of it, I can grab my little tool here. Let's say we want, what happens if we increase the blue? I just click on this and then I move my mouse up and it raises the curve. It's raising the amount of blue, and that's going to change the color of that. And that's a trick that we'll actually use when we fix the color in the image. So I think this video is getting quite lengthy and it's probably a little bit boring, but I wanted to make a couple of points, about the fact that there is a histogram, about how the curve in general works, and just so that you get a feel for that. Really the best way is just to start playing with this stuff and see how it works out. Because in the videos that follow, when we actually start correcting the color of this faded locomotive, we're going to make extensive use of curves. And I'll probably, even though I'm going to try to go slow to explain what I'm doing, some of it may come by a little bit rapidly. So you may want to come back and review this video, some of the points that I've made in it. And as I said, feel free to play with the curves adjustment layers and try to get comfortable. One thing I haven't mentioned, of course, is this layer mask here. That's also critically important. I want to talk about color as such. And I've got two boxes here, one of which is white, one of which I think is pretty close to factory fresh BNSF orange. If we want to see what color that is, we can bring up this info box. Just hold our cursor over it. You see in the red, green, blue up in the top right hand corner it says 248, 118, 12. That's pretty close. I mean, you're going to find some variation in the field among new units. I did an average over quite a few brand new factory fresh units, and this is pretty close to what I think is the right color. Anyway, let's do something for fun here. Let's click the eyedropper tool and come down here and pick up some of the worst faded orange that we can find. That's about right here, I guess. And let's click on this document here, and then we'll do a alternate backspace to fill with that color. So this kind of faded peach color, if you will, skin tone almost, is the faded area of orange. Doesn't look anything like the orange above it. Let's see how these differ. Let me actually do a shift click in here, and that defines a little marker point, and then I'll come up to this document and we'll do a shift click there as well. I guess it's not going to show us across two documents, but that's all right. One thing to notice, I said this was 248, 118, 12, and this one is 229, 192, 171. So what's the difference here really? Well, the first thing is there's a whole lot more green, but there's way more blue. I mean, remember, this number was 12, right? And this number is 171. So that means there's way too much blue in this color right here as compared to what we want. Keeping that in mind, that does suggest how we can get from this peach color to this bright orange color is by just simply making a curves adjustment until these numbers are correct. So let's keep this in mind, 248, 118, 12, and let's go to this image and add a curves adjustment layer. And we'll adjust the channels individually. So let's go to the red channel, and we note, let me actually just use this, it's easier. I'll click here. My input is 230, so that tells me that the red component is 230, and I really wanted it to be, what did I say, 248, I think? So if I move up, there's 248. I apologize that I should have written this down, but I haven't. Yeah, 248. Next we want 118, and then we want 12. So we come back here, and we'll go to the green channel. We want 118, and we've got 192, so let's bring that down to 118. I'm just pulling down, straight down on the mouse, holding the left button. And now let's go to the blue channel. Here we want 12, and we've got 171, so this is going to be a pretty drastic adjustment here. We pull that down to 12, right there. And now let's go back here. And lo and behold, both of these colors are now exactly the same. And if I go back to my little info box here, you can see this is before on the left side and after over here. So we went from 229 to 248, from 192 to 118, and from 171 to 12. And lo and behold, we changed this faded, almost flesh tone color into factory fresh orange. And we did that by this curve right here. What we did was we made the red just a little bit brighter. The red really wasn't too much of a problem. We made the green quite a bit darker, and we made the blue just a ridiculous amount darker. So this set of curves here, red, green, and blue, kind of hints at a solution to the problem of the faded paint. And you know, this is going to be another long video, but just bear with me. I want to show you something. Let's go ahead and close these two colors here, and let's control minus so we can see more of the locomotive. Having just looked at those two colors and their constituent components, let's now go to the channels tool, whatever you want to call it. And what do you think is going to happen if I click on the red channel here? What would you expect to see? Well, it looks pretty clean, really. Now, keep in mind, this is the red component of the entire image, so of course it looks a little artificial. This is what would happen if you were shooting black and white film through a red filter. But what I want you to notice is the uniformity of the paint. Look at the orange paint here, which is now just a shade of gray. But notice that you don't really see any streaking in it. And that's not surprising because the red channel was really pretty clean and we didn't have to make much of an adjustment to it. Now let's go to the green channel and look at that. Now we can start to see a little bit of streaking. You can see a little bit of streakiness here and here, and you notice that these doors are ever so slightly lighter than those doors. So there is some variance in the green, but not a lot. But when we go to the blue channel, that's where we have a real mess, because the thing to note here is all of this should be the same color orange, which means it should be the same color, it should have the same amount of blue in it. But you notice that some of the areas are quite dark and others are quite light. So what I am telling you, what this image is telling you, is that the blue channel is the one that's really massively screwed up. And the problem with it is it's way too light, because remember, our target color only had a blue component of 12, which is actually really, really dark. And as we look at this, we see a lot of problems here. So that's really what we're going to have to work with. After what seems like a lot of screwing around, we're actually going to get around to correcting the faded orange paint in this video. Let's go over and look at channels real briefly, because one of the things I didn't talk about last time was layer masks, and we're going to need one of those. And looking at these three channels, red, green, and blue, it seems to me that blue is probably going to be our best place to start for a layer mask, because what we're looking for is a mask that's going to be white where we want our changes to take effect and black everywhere else. And I think
You know, you really could start with any of them, especially the red, but I think the blue is going to work better. So let's take the blue channel, drag it down here, and make a duplicate of it. And then I will show you this channel here, which is one that I took the liberty of making in advance because it did take a little while to make this, and I'll show you how to do that in a later video. Basically, this one is mostly white wherever there's orange, and it's black everywhere else. So what this does is it really isolates the orange color of the locomotive. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to control click this to load it as a selection. Now I'm going to go down to this blue copy channel, and I'm going to do a Control Shift I, and what that does is that just selects the inverse. So in other words, in the orange mask, everywhere was selected was white, and so now I've just selected the black. Now I'm going to do an alternate backspace, which of course fills that area with black. Now I'm going to do a Control D to deselect. So here is our blue copy layer, and the other thing I'm going to do now is I'm going to do a Control M, which brings up the curves box, and I'm going to drag this right hand over until I get part of my mask here to be pure white. And I know in advance that that's roughly about here. You can't actually see it, but if I move over, you can now see that the brightest parts of this mask are approximately white. So I'm going to say OK. And now this is going to be the layer mask that we use for our curves adjustment layer. So if we come back to RGB, we come down here, add a curves adjustment layer. I'm not actually going to adjust the curve yet, but I'm going to go back to my channels. First, I'm going to delete this default layer mask. I'm going to go back to channels. I'm going to control click this blue copy that we made, and now I'm going to add that as my layer mask. So if we hold down the Option key and click, there's my layer mask, and I do that again, and here's my curve. So now it's time to adjust the curve. We notice our histogram is wrong, so we push this button. And now let's look at our channels. Here's red, here's green, and here's blue. So let's start with red. And actually, you know, I'd been telling you these last few videos that my preference for color was 248, 118, 12 RGB. I'm actually going to go back to an older standard because I think it works better in this image, and my older standard was 255, 117, 26. So it's very similar, but it's just ever so slightly a different color, and it happens to work out better for this image. So what I'm going to do is on the red channel, I'm going to grab at the left side of this peak here. Now I'm going to drag that up to 255. I'm going to go over to the green channel. On the right hand side of this, I'm going to pull down to about 117. And again, these don't have to be exact. And I'm going to go over to the blue channel, and over here at the right side of this thing, I'm going to drag down to about 26 or thereabout. And right about there. And as you can see, we've done a pretty good job of fixing the faded orange. Now it's not perfect. You know, you can see here on the nose there's a few spots here and there, and maybe over here, where we didn't quite get the color right, but that's okay. I mean, I think as a first approximation, this is a pretty good attempt at fixing that faded orange. Now, we'll come back in the next video and we'll clean up these areas that didn't quite make the cut here. We got started on fixing the faded orange paint. We did a pretty good job, but we still left a few areas you can see up here by the number boards, and in some of the really badly faded areas we still have some touch up to do, so let's do that. We'll create a new curves adjustment layer here. We won't play with the curve just yet. We will delete this default layer mask. And now what we're going to do is we're going to come up here and we're going to use the select color range command. I've got my, I'll move this up here so you can actually see it, my fuzziness at 10, which is quite low. And we'll just start by clicking maybe here. And now I'm going to do Control-Alt-0 so we can actually see what we're doing. If I hold the space bar down, I get the hand tool so I can move around. And I'm going to click this tool to add to my selection. And what I'm going to try to do is just click in these areas where I think the color is not what it should be. In other words, it's a little splotchy. We've got some almost green looking color here, maybe that highlight, maybe that area right there. And then we'll come out here and try to pick up these badly faded areas just by clicking around in them a few times. Again, we're just trying to create a selection of the colors that don't look factory fresh, because that's what we're after here. And you know, we just click and click and click. It's important that we don't click on any of the areas we've already fixed, or we'll have a mess. Now I'm going to leave this dark, dirty area here, and we'll probably fix that with a separate layer. But I'm just trying to pick up some of these colors, and let's see how that looks. Probably going to Control minus a couple times here so we can see. And now I'm going to do the following. I'm going to come up here and I'm going to say select. I'm going to say modify. I'm going to say expand by 2 pixels. And then I'm going to say select, modify, feather by 2 pixels. Now one last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add that as my layer mask here. Now I'm going to come back and I'm going to control click this orange mask that I'd created, because that will help us out. And now I'm going to do a Control Shift I to select the inverse, and I'm going to do a Control backspace. And what that did was, in case my selection had bled outside of the orange, say into the yellow or the black or something, that just stopped that. So now I'm going to do a Control D, and we're ready to edit our curve. And here, for the curious, there is our mask that we just created. So now let's edit the curve, and we'll do that by correcting our histogram. We'll go into red. We'll take red to 255, which it pretty much already is. We'll take green to 117, which it's not really very far off either. These should be pretty minor corrections actually, because we weren't that far off. And we'll take the blue to 26, like about right there. And let's see if we got anything done here. So there's before and there's after. And you notice, like, look at this area up here, which wasn't quite right before. It may be hard to see in the video, but I think we've improved that. Or look at the faded areas out here. So that was just kind of a minor touch-up. And right now, I think that this looks pretty good. I want to show you how I created the orange mask that I used in the last 2 videos. You'll recall that we created these 2 curves to correct the faded orange paint, and it really looks pretty nice at this point. But there was one little step that I'd done behind the scenes that you didn't get to see that's quite important. So let's turn these 2 layers off, and we'll just look at the work layer here. And specifically what I'm talking about is this orange mask channel that I created, and I want to show you how it was I did that. So the way I did that was by starting with the original image and looking at the 3 channels. So here's red, here's green, and here's blue. And what I'm looking for is a channel that is very clean, that's going to give me white everywhere the orange paint exists. So clearly that's going to be the red channel. That's going to be my best starting point. So I'm going to take that and I'm going to drag that down here to create a copy of it. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a Control M, and this is going to allow me to increase the contrast of it, because I really want this channel to be as white as it can be where it's orange and black everywhere else. So I'm gonna pull this over to about 220, and I know this is tough because of this small screen. You really can't see a lot of what's going on in the background. And I'm gonna pull this over to try to darken up the black parts, and I figure I can pull this over to about 40. I don't want it to darken this side of the nose too much, but it's okay if it darkens it a little. So we're just gonna say that this curve here is about okay. So here we've got to start on this. Now the next thing we're going to do, I'm going to do a Control minus one time so we can see what we're doing here, is I'm just going to take the lasso tool, and we're done here. We're just going to be working on this red copy layer, so I'll get that out of the way. Now I guess we can zoom back in here. I'm going to take the lasso tool and I'm going to make a real crude selection of the orange. So I'm just going to come through the yellow here, up around the top of the cab, into the background here a little bit, down around the nose, down here into the pilot, across the bottom, then back up into the yellow, over here onto the walkway. Could actually get up into that yellow stripe there if I wanted, and then back around like this. Okay, so I've basically made a real crude selection of the orange. Now I'm going to do a Control Shift I to select exactly the opposite of that. Since my foreground color is black, I will do an alternate backspace, and that will fill the selected area with black. So now I'm going to do a Control D to deselect. So here we are. Let's Control Alt 0 to get 100%. I hold the space bar, of course. You'll learn all these shortcuts as you work with Photoshop to move around. And now I like to work at about 200%, so I'll Control plus one more time. You notice it says 200%, so that's our magnification. And there's really no magic to this. This mask layer, we remember what we did is we started with the red channel because that was really as close as we could get to an ideal channel to work with for what we wanted. And now we've just got to clean it up. So the way to do that is with the paintbrush. You'll notice that my hardness is 100%. My opacity is 100%, so we're ready to go. We'll use the left and right bracket keys to get an appropriate size brush, and I like to work with something about like this. And I'm just going to click here, because this is yellow up here top. I'm going to click here on this, I've moved my brush to where I'm about at the bottom of that black stripe, and I click once, and then I come along that stripe there, and now I'm going to shift click right here, and then I'm going to paint in like this. And we're going to continue this way, and we're just going to paint and paint and paint. And really, there's no magic to any of this. Of course, you know, we're going to have to paint these letters and whatnot, and we're going to have to paint away the windows and this radome up here and the number boards and the windows and the top of the nose. I mean, there's a lot of work to do, okay, so don't get me wrong. But there's no magic here. We're just basically taking the paintbrush. And the trick that I like to use is to shift click, because when I click once and then I move and then I shift click, see, that makes a straight line. So anywhere you can do a straight line, you're better off. And you work around the borders like this, and then you can be quite sloppy as you fill in the interior. And so what we're ultimately trying to get is this orange channel right here. So this is what it should look like when it's done. And you can tell that I've painted everywhere you see black, that's basically where I've painted away the things that aren't orange, which is what we want. So as I move around here and show this, let's back out a little bit, and you can see this is what the orange mask should look like. And of course, I've painted out the handrail and the handrail shadow and all of these little stickers and a couple of these grills. I mean, perhaps I should have painted this one out as well. I painted out the numbers, the windshields, the number boards. So yes, it is a little bit of work. It probably took roughly a half hour to create this mask, but as you saw last couple of videos, it was very useful to us, because what this did was this allowed us to make sure that our color correction stayed confined to strictly the orange paint. And as I explained last time, we really couldn't use this directly as our layer mask. We had to modify it so that we could make the color adjustments selective depending on what the fading was. So this is just a brief explanation of how I created that orange mask, and like I say, it's about a half hour worth of work, so it's not a lot of fun, but then again, it's not terribly difficult either, but I just thought you should know how it was made. I think we'll clean up the yellow. We've got several things to do here. We need to clean up these handrails and the anti-climber. We've also got a couple of areas back here, this dirty yellow on the stripe, and this yellow up here that's a little bit too orange. The remarkable thing about this locomotive is that the yellow is in remarkably good shape, just as is, so there's actually very little work to do. And in this video, we're only going to work on this section up here, because the other areas are going to be very similarly treated. So we'll do that with a curves adjustment layer, of course, so let's go ahead and create one of those. We won't mess with the curve yet. We will get rid of the default mask. And I think what we'll do, let's Control plus so we can zoom in and see what we're doing here. Let's take the lasso tool and let's make a crude selection of just the yellow that we want to fix, which will be this area here. Something like about this. And the only reason I'm doing this is to constrain my color range tool. You notice I've made just a very crude selection here with the lasso. So this selects the area that you can see with the dots. And now I'm going to come up under Select Color Range, and I usually work with a fairly low fuzziness of about 10, and we'll start just by clicking here. And now I'll click the Add tool, and I'll just rub it around. I'm holding the mouse, the left mouse button down as I move around, trying to pick up all these various colors here. And you can see in the little preview window which colors I've picked and which ones I haven't. Unfortunately, that's not a particularly useful tool. They really could have made that a lot better. If I need to move, I hold the space bar down and then I can move. And so now I'm going to pick up this darker section over here, and I just click a couple of times in some of these areas to try to pick that up. Now you can see these handrails haven't been picked up very well, but that's okay. And there's also an area right through here that doesn't look like it's been picked up. So we'll say, okay, that's good enough. Hit OK. And you can see this is our selection. It's obviously not perfect, but it's a good start. So let's go over to our layers palette, and we will click on Add Layer Mask. And so now there's the layer mask we just created with the lasso tool and the select color range. And it's not great, but it'll work for now. So let's alternate click that again. And now it's time to actually work with the curve. But before we do that, we need to really figure out what color yellow it is we're aiming for. And I think that we should just make the yellow here the same as the yellow over here. So let's find out what color that is by picking an eyedropper. And, well, actually, I've already clicked one spot there. And you can see that it's 255, 200, 0. So that's easy enough to remember. So now let's go back here to our curve and let's work on it. We'll correct the histogram there. And we want our red to be 255. Now, why do we have two of these peaks? It's instructive to think about what these mean. Well, it's pretty obvious. This is a much darker shade of yellow than this is. So it seems reasonable that this peak over here to the right, which is brighter, is probably this area of yellow. And this peak over here is this area of yellow. So we want this to be 255. But I don't really want this shaded area to look the same as this. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pull this over to about right there. So what I've done by doing that is I've made everything to the right of this point 255, and then we just have this linear slope back down. So this will be a little bit darker, but notice that I have actually brightened it over what it was. So that's our red channel. Our green channel, we want it to be 200. And again, we see these two peaks, so I'm going to make the left one 200, and that actually has to come up a little bit. So 200 is about right there, and we'll just call it something about like that. The blue channel, of course, we want to be 0, and I'll just drag this over to, I don't know, somewhere in there. It's not real critical, but again, we see these two peaks for the dark and the light part. And we've just made that 0 all the way over to about here. So let's see what that looks like. To my eye, at least, I'm going to back out just a little bit here. What I was really trying to do was make this yellow down here the same as this yellow here. And it's pretty close. To my eye, it still looks just a tinge green. Now, the beautiful thing about these adjustment layers is we can go back and we can adjust them. So if I thought it was too green, I think the solution would probably be to reduce the amount of green somewhat. And I'm just watching in the image as I move this curve. And I think maybe somewhere about right there is a little bit better. But nonetheless, it's a season to taste, I guess. The next thing we need to do, I'm going to zoom back in here to about 200%, is we need to clean up this mask. Because you can see it's a little bit, that's what it looks like. And the effects are visible. So let's go ahead and you notice that we're painting on this mask. I'm going to, my foreground color is white here. I'm going to pick up my paintbrush. It's 100% hardness, and the opacity is 100%. So now what I'm going to do, using my bracket keys, I'm going to pick a brush about like this, and I'm going to click and shift click and click and shift click so that I paint in these lines. Click, shift click, click, shift click. And that makes it much, much faster. And you can see I've really cleaned up that area very quickly. And I can do the same thing over here by click and shift click and just, painting here in the middle. And we'll click and shift click over there. So now I would say the anti-climber looks beautiful, right? Now we just need to work on these stanchions, I guess they're called. And we can just paint those either by hand, or we could even zoom in a little bit and use a slightly smaller brush if we want. And of course, this doesn't have to be perfect. If we happen to spill outside of the lines, we could simply change the color of our brush to black and then paint out any mistakes. And the only comment that I'll make is, you notice as I paint over here, I don't really get the effect that I want because this color, the paint had completely fallen off of there. So I think probably the way to fix that is with another curves, with a separate curves adjustment layer. But click, shift click, you get the general idea. But anyway, let's do a Control Alt 0. So here it is at 100%. And we've still got some work to do with this video. Is getting quite long and quite large, so I'm just going to cut it out here and finish the rest of it. But I think this gives you the general idea of how to go about fixing this.
And as I said, for the areas that are almost white, like perhaps this area here, perhaps some of the handrails where the paint has rubbed off, or for the areas that are very rusty, or for the areas that are black, again, where the paint has rubbed off, I think that calls for a separate curve adjustment layer. But again, all we're doing is we're just taking the color that we have, and we are making that 255, 200, 0 with an appropriate mask, and that's really all there is to it. And so by now I think you probably figured out that curves adjustment layers are the way to correct colors, and that's that. How we can clean up the fuel tanks, and of course where there's a will there's a way. Let's think about that. Actually, let's turn some of our existing layers off, everything except our work layer, and let's grab our work layer and make a copy of it. Let's turn the work layer off and let's work on this work copy. The first thing I'm going to do, oddly enough, is go to my channels palette, and I'm going to look at my various channels. Here's red. I'm looking at the fuel tank, mind you. Here's green, and here's blue, and I'm looking to see which one is cleanest. Now, I personally think it's the green one, so we'll do the following. We'll do a Control-A for select all. We will do a Control-C for copy. We'll come up here to the red channel, and we'll do a Control-V for paste. So now notice the red and the green channel are the same. Let's go to the blue channel and do a Control-V, and now all of my channels are the same, and in fact I have a monochrome image here on my work copy, which is exactly what I want. Now, the next thing let's do, let's go over here and do a Control-D for deselect, pick up our lasso tool, and let's make a crude selection of the fuel tank, something about like this. And don't worry that we're being sloppy here, I said it's crude. Now we'll come back to the layers palette, and we will add a layer mask to this layer, and let's also turn on our work layer so we can see what's going on. So there we have just the fuel tank and a relatively crude selection. So the next thing we'll do is let's clean up this work layer layer mask, and we'll do that with the brush tool. And we will pick the brush tool. We will pick relative hardness, something like that, fairly hard brush. We'll use our bracket keys. Let's do a Control-Alt-0 and a Control+ to get to 200% and make our brush a little smaller. And now let's just use the old click and shift click. And then of course we're just painting this out. That's all we're doing. We're just touching up this mask here like so. And I'm going to do a few of these here for you, and then we'll come right back. So let's continue painting now. Looking here along the bottom, I'm going to get as close as I can to the tank. I'm going to click, come down here again, and shift click, and we'll just paint out that. The rest of this I'm not going to worry too much about, although I should note that there are a couple of little color areas in here, namely this cap right here. There's a little sticker here. This thing is red. This thing has some color to it. And somewhere in here is another red cap, something like that. And if I want to see that, I can come up here to my layers palette and turn this off just briefly and look for the things that are colored. All right, so you get the idea. Control-Alt-0, so there's 100%. So what have we done here? We have made this monochrome, which makes it more silver looking. Of course, it gets rid of the rust. Now what I want to do is try to brighten up this dark grimy area, and the way I'm going to do that is by adding a curves adjustment layer to this work copy layer. However, before I do that, I've got to come back here. Let's delete this default layer mask. I'm going to click on this work copy layer mask, and I'm going to control click it to make it a selection. Now I'm going to select my new curves adjustment layer and add that as a layer mask. Now why did I do that? I did that so when I work on the curve here and I update my histogram, now it's going to show me just this area that I've selected. And since that's monochrome, we would expect the red, the green, and the blue channels all to look exactly the same as they do. So let's just work on the luminance channel now, and let's get our little tool here. And you notice that we have highlight areas like this, this highlight here. We have dark shadow areas back in here, and we have everything in between. I would say that we have a medium tone somewhere here, right in the center, which is not surprising. But this area is a little grimy. It's down here. So let's see if we can grab this and move up, because we want to brighten it. Now there's a limit to what we can do, because if we go crazy and we bring it up to here, then that looks completely
fake. So let's only bring it up just a little bit. And if we want, we can probably bring this down a little. But again, we don't want to make it too flat or the thing just becomes a muddy gray. So I think really something about like that is not so bad. Now there's one other little trick that I want to show you here. I'm going to go to the blue channel and I'm going to pull this right hand side in just a little bit, maybe to about here. And what this is doing is it's adding just a little bit. You can see since this blue line is above the default curve, we're adding just a little bit of blue into the highlights. And that's because silver under sunlight will actually appear to be somewhat blue. And we can, of course, since this is a curves adjustment layer, we can come back and we can adjust that later. So there it is before that, and there it is after that. So let's back out just a little, and let's actually turn on some of our other layers so we can see what we have done. So anyway, here's our locomotive with our, that's before we cleaned up the fuel tank, and that's after. Now you're saying, well, wait a minute, you're into the trucks. We can get a bonus by cleaning up the trucks as well, and the way we will do that is we will select our work layer here, and we will select this layer mask, and let's do a Control-Alt-0 and a Control+, so now we're at 200%. Let's grab our paintbrush, and let's make our foreground color white, and our brush hardness and opacity are what we want them to be. And so now let's just paint, and we'll paint out all of the rust on the trucks here. Rust be gone, right? Now I'm being a little sloppy here, and I'm going to have to go back and clean this up. Fully aware of that. That's the beauty of layer mask. It's very easy to do. And when we get over here, we'll just come up here and we will click along that green edge, and we'll come down here and shift click, and then we'll of course paint that out. And I'm just looking for any little areas I might have missed, and maybe this along through here. And now I'm going to do an X to make my background black, and just to make sure I clean up some things. So let's clean up these wheels here, just things that we don't want to be silver. And we don't want those concrete ties to be silver. We don't want this wheel to be silver. So you see I'm just cleaning up the areas where I kind of spilled over and made a little bit of a mess. Now the one thing you're probably objecting to, and rightfully so, let's actually paint this little label out here. And if we want to see if there's anything that is supposed to be in color, just turn this layer off. And well, there's this one little tiny spot. Being a perfectionist here, let's color that little sticker red, and let's also color this rubber hose black like this, just by painting down there. It's kind of rust color, but oh well. Anyway, now you've noticed that this is much brighter than this, and there's a reason for that. That's because, come up here, let's delete this layer mask. Now everything's ridiculously bright, but remember how we fix that. We go to our work copy, we control click the layer mask here, we come up here and add it there. So now if we Control-Alt-0 and Control-, here is our cleaned up truck, our cleaned up tank. We can do the same thing to the rear truck, and I think that looks pretty nice, don't you? I want to lighten up the dark side of the nose a little bit, and of course I'm sure you're not going to be surprised that we're going to do that by adding yet another curves adjustment layer. So there we go, and we're not really going to mess with that. Let's go ahead and delete the layer mask as we usually do. And now what I want to do is I want to take my polygonal lasso tool, and I'm going to draw just a very crude outline of the dark side of the nose. That's what I'm going to do here. And like I say, this is a little crude, but that's all we need for our purposes here. Just trying to get that outline, and that's going to be our start of our layer mask, of course. So we're going to add layer mask, and now so that we can refine this layer mask and see it, let's go into the curve itself, and let's do something crazy like just pull this green all the way up like that, so clearly you can see that where that's taking effect. And let's back this opacity, I don't know, down here somewhere like that. So now you can clearly see where the mask is, and of course we want to work on the mask, so it's important that you see that little white rim around that there. So now what we're ready to do is grab our paintbrush, and instead of clicking this, I will use the B key for brush. I'm going to put my hardness at about 50%, and my opacity 100%, and I'm already 100% view, and I'm going to Control plus to work at 200 because I find that's a little easier. So now I'm going to use my bracket keys here, and I'm just going to do the old click shift click trick. That's a mouthful. And what I'm trying to do here, of course, is just paint out the areas of the mask that don't belong. Now, as we go along here, we're just trying to get rid of that. And the reason I'm doing this is so that I can make a more intelligent curves adjustment layer with my curve, because I don't really know exactly what I want to do with my curve just yet. And the better I mask this off, the easier that's going to be. So you can see I'm just kind of trimming along here. I know for a fact that we're going to have to do a little better than this, but let's back off just a little so we can see here. And now let's go back to our curve and let's reset the silliness. Remember, we just did that to help us see that layer mask there. And now let's calculate our histogram and see what things look like. So here is our red channel. And let's try the following. Remember, the color of orange that we targeted on this was 255, 117, 26. So if this histogram is approximately correct, and it's not exactly correct because there's still stuff in here that our mask is allowing that we shouldn't have, but I think it's close enough. So I'm going to make this 255, right? And that's what I'm doing by dragging this over. So I'm saying the left side of this peak here is 255. Let's go over to green. It's a little hard to interpret, but we're going to have to drag this up to 117 somewhere. So let's just pick, I don't know, right there. And on the blue, we want 26, and that's going to be somewhere, I don't know, in here, something like that. And this is an initial adjustment of our curve. Doesn't have to be final. Now, that doesn't look entirely horrible. You see, it definitely has light in the nose, but notice our opacity is 34. If we crank that all the way to 100, well, that clearly looks ridiculous, but this does hint at what we're going to do. As it turns out, we're probably only going to use an opacity of about 50%, somewhere in that neighborhood when we're done. But for now, let's leave this up at 100%, and let's go back and work on our mask, because that's really a problem at this point. So let's zoom in a couple times maybe. And what I'm looking for here is, you notice wherever the orange has turned yellow, that's an area that's been hit by the sun, and we don't want that. So let's take our hardness down a little bit, make the brush a little bit softer. And I always use my bracket keys to get the size that I want. And I'm going to go into these yellow areas and just paint them out, because these are sunlit areas and I really don't want them. I'm also going to paint out the windshield wipers here. And again, if I spill over the edges a little bit, I can go back and clean it up if I feel that I must. One place where we clearly do need to mask this off is this black stripe, because we really don't want the black to get any lighter. So as you can see, it's really not too hard just by shift clicking. Even though this is curved through here, it still works pretty good. So through the magic of video editing, I have refined my layer mask, and let's take a look and see what that looks like right now. So that's kind of what it looks like. Not too surprising. It's a little crude because we've drawn most of it by hand, but it gets the job done. So here is our adjustment, and as you can see, it looks ridiculous. But again, I told you that we were going to fix that with opacity. So now let's turn the opacity down. And of course, if we turn it all the way down, there's what the image started as. And as we crank this up, you can see the nose getting lighter and lighter and lighter. And I find really, in order to judge this, let's do a Control 0. Let's adjust the opacity until this looks right. See, this is clearly too bright, not believable, and that's darker than we want. So we need to find a compromise, and you can see probably somewhere right around there. That's too much by my eye. Still maybe just a tiny bit too much. That's not too bad right there. Let's Control Alt 0 and look at this at 100%. And let's just toggle this layer on a couple times. So there's before and there's after, and I think that's actually not too bad. I don't notice anything particularly distracting about that, because remember, the goal here is to make it look unedited. If you can tell that it's been edited, you haven't really done your job. In this case, I think that's not too bad. So there is the image, and I think we've really finished this up. I guess one final comment that I can make is that I already did add a green layer, and if I turn that off, you can see, look at the side sill and the walkway here as I toggle this layer on and off. And basically all I did was, you notice that some of the green down here in this lower area is a bit faded and grimy, and I just applied this curve right here with this mask, which was done using a fairly liberal select color range restricted by the lasso tool. So really no magic there, but I figured I didn't need to bore you with a video showing you that, because it's basically the same thing we did with the orange layer and the yellow layer. We just did a curves adjustment layer to fix that portion of the green. I kind of judged that the rest of the green was clean enough. So I think overall, in my opinion, this locomotive is now done. I just want to take a look back and see where we've come with this image. Let's Control-Alt-0 and then Control-, so now we're looking at this Control- again there at 50%. So here is our finished locomotive, and let's look at what we've done here by turning off all of these layers down to where we started. So here's the image that we started with, and we note that the fuel tank is scratched, the trucks are grimy, the orange is badly faded, the green's got some paint missing, the nose is dark, and we've fixed all of these things through a variety of techniques. The first one, of course, this layer, is really just a copy of the background layer where we've done some cloning to fix the scratches in the fuel tank, some rust spots here on the anti-climber, and some spots on the roof. Then, of course, in a much later video, we added this monochrome layer here for the trucks and the fuel tank, and then we brightened it up with this curves layer. Of course, we fixed the orange faded paint, but we didn't quite get that done with one layer, so then we added a second layer to touch up those little pieces. We added this layer to fix the yellow here up on the anti-climber and the handrails up front. We added this layer to fix the green along the side sills and the step wells. And lastly, of course, we added a layer to brighten the nose. So that's really what we've done. And some of you may say, well, yeah, that's all fine and well, but that took a long time. Well, think of it this way. I mean, how much time did you spend in the field actually getting this shot in the first place? I mean, in my own personal experience, it's not uncommon to be out for hours on end. You know, you're out all day long and maybe you only take a few photographs. So, I mean, how many hours did you spend just getting the photograph? And then you say, well, you know, doesn't it make sense that I should spend at least a little bit of time post-processing this to make it what I wanted? Because getting back to where I started with this, you know, I said, look, here's what the camera actually captured out in the field, was this image here. And I really don't like that. I mean, it's not a bad shot, but the locomotive just kind of ruins it. But we don't have to live with that. We don't have to be satisfied with that, because really without a great deal of effort and just a little bit of time, we can change that into this. And I really think that's worth doing, and I hope you've enjoyed these videos. I hope you've learned from them, and most of all, I hope that you'll be able to apply these to your own work and be able to really get the image that you want instead of the image that you simply had to accept.